November 2, 2023. A song played on radios across the world. The voice was unmistakable. John Lennon was singing. But John Lennon had been dead for 43 years, and the man who made it happen was sitting alone, listening, tears streaming down his face. Paul McCartney had done the impossible. He had brought his best friend back from the grave. But this story doesn't begin in 2023. It begins in a cramped New York apartment in 1978, where a man who had once changed the world was hiding from it. John Lennon had disappeared. After years of fighting for peace, making headlines, battling the U.S. government for the right to stay in America, John had simply stopped. He retreated into the Dakota building on the Upper West Side. He baked bread. He raised his son Sean. He watched television. The man who had screamed revolution into microphones now whispered lullabies. And somewhere in that quiet exile, he sat down at a piano. The apartment was dim. Yoko was somewhere else in the building. Sean was asleep. John pressed record on a simple cassette player and began to play. The melody was fragile, hesitant, like a man trying to remember something he once knew how to feel. He sang about time, about waiting, about a love that distance couldn't destroy. The song was called Now and Then. He never finished it. The cassette sat in a drawer for years. John added it to a collection of demos he planned to work on someday. That someday never came. On December 8, 1980, Mark David Chapman waited outside the Dakota with a gun and a copy of The Catcher in the Rye. John Lennon was shot 4 times in the back. He was pronounced dead at 11. The song in the drawer would remain unfinished. The voice on that tape would never sing in a studio again, or so everyone thought. The first attempt to resurrect Now and Then came in 19. The 3 surviving Beatles, Paul, George, and Ringo, had gathered for the anthology project. It was supposed to be a celebration, a documentary, a reunion of sorts, even though the 4th chair would forever remain empty. Yoko Ono gave them the cassette. "John would have wanted you to finish it," she said. Paul held the tape like it was a holy relic. This was John's voice, John's melody, John's unfinished thought, frozen in time. They tried in the studio. They played the demo through the speakers. John's voice filled the room, distant and ghostly, buried under layers of piano and tape hiss. The technology of 1994 couldn't separate them. Every time they tried to isolate John's vocals, the piano bled through. Every time they tried to add new instruments, John's voice disappeared into the noise. George Harrison sat in the corner, growing frustrated. "It's f***ing rubbish," he finally said. The words hung in the air. Paul wanted to argue, but he couldn't. George was right. The technology simply wasn't there. They managed to complete 2 other Lennon demos, Free as a Bird and Real Love, but Now and Then defeated them. The tape went back in the drawer. George would later say he never wanted to hear it again. But what nobody knew was that Paul never stopped thinking about that song. For nearly 30 years it haunted him. Every technological advancement, every new piece of studio equipment, he would wonder, is this the one? Can we finally do it now? The answer was always no. And then George died. November 29, 2001. Cancer. Another Beatle gone. Another empty chair. Now it was just Paul and Ringo, 2 survivors of the greatest band in history, carrying a legacy that grew heavier with each passing year. Paul visited the studio less. He toured relentlessly, perhaps to outrun the ghosts, but the creative spark that had once defined him seemed dimmer. The unfinished song became a symbol of everything he had lost. Every interview that mentioned John, every fan who asked about a reunion, every December 8th anniversary, they all reminded him of that tape gathering dust. The song John never finished. The conversation they never had. The goodbye that never came. Then in 2020, Peter Jackson was working on Get Back, his documentary about the Beatles' final sessions. He had a problem. The original footage from 1969 was a mess. Multiple conversations happening at once. Music bleeding into dialogue. Layers of sound that seemed impossible to untangle. His team developed new technology, machine learning, artificial intelligence that could be trained on specific voices and taught to separate them from everything else. When Paul saw what they had done, isolating John's voice from 50-year-old footage with crystal clarity, He felt something he hadn't felt in decades. Hope. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Are you sure?" Ringo asked. Paul wasn't sure. He hadn't been sure about anything involving John since night, but he knew one thing. If they didn't try now, they never would. He was 80 years old. Ringo was 80. Time was no longer a luxury they possessed. "John would want us to," Paul said. Another pause. "Then let's bring him home." The sessions began in secret. Paul arrived at his studio with the original cassette. The same tape Yoko had given them, and the same recording that had defeated them 30 years earlier. But now they had machine-assisted learning. The AI had been trained on hours of John's isolated vocals, learning every nuance of his voice, every breath, every imperfection that made him John. The technicians fed the demo into the system. For a moment, nothing happened. Then John's voice emerged from the speakers, clean, clear, separated from the piano that had imprisoned it for 45 years. Paul stopped breathing. It was him. It was really him, not a memory, not an impression. John Lennon, singing in 2022 as if he had just stepped out of the room for a moment and finally returned. But could they really do this? The question haunted Paul through every session. Was this honoring John's legacy or exploiting it? Was this completion or desecration? Would people hear a Beatles reunion or a technological Frankenstein? He thought about what George had said in rubbish. George wasn't here to object anymore. George couldn't stop them, and somehow that made it worse. Paul called Ringo again. "Do you think George would hate this?" Ringo considered the question carefully. "George hated a lot of things," he finally said. "But he loved John, and he loved the Beatles. I think he'd want John's song to exist in the world, even if he complained about it the whole time." Paul laughed for the first time in weeks. They kept working. The process was painstaking. John had only recorded a rough demo vocal and piano, nothing more. Paul and Ringo had to build an entire song around it. Bass, drums, guitar, strings. But it had to sound like the beat, not a Paul McCartney solo track with John's voice pasted on top. It had to sound like four men in a room, creating magic together. Paul played bass lines he thought John would like. He heard John's voice in his head, criticizing every note. "Too busy, Macca. Keep it simple." He simplified. Ringo approached the drums the same way he always had, serving the song, never showing off. What would John want became the mantra of every decision. And then there was George. They couldn't make a Beatles song without George Harrison. But George was gone. His guitar had been silent for over 2 decades. Paul remembered something. During the anthology sessions in 1995, George had recorded guitar parts for Now and Then. They hadn't used them. The overall track was too messy. But the isolated guitar recordings still existed. They found the tapes. George's slide guitar, recorded nearly 30 years earlier, was layered into the new track. 4 Beatles. 1 song, recorded across 5 decades. Paul added one final touch. In the outro, he played a guitar pattern that referenced Here, There and Everywhere. A song he had written in 1966, when they were young, when death was something that happened to other people. Then he added something else. 3 words, sung quietly, almost a whisper, underneath John's final notes. "I love you." John would never hear them. But maybe somehow it didn't matter. November 222. The song was released to the world. Within hours, it reached #1 in 15 countries. Critics called it a technological miracle and a haunting farewell. Fans wept in public, hearing John's voice again for the first time in 4 decades. But Paul didn't celebrate. He sat in his studio alone, listening to the final mix. John's voice filled the room. That voice he had known since he was 15 years old. Standing at a church fair in Liverpool, watching a boy in a leather jacket play rock and roll. 66 years. They had known each other for 66 years. Or at least, John had been in his life for 66 years. Dead or alive, John Lennon was still the first person Paul thought of when he wrote a good melody. Still the critic in his head. Still the brother he could never quite make peace with. And now, finally, they had made one last song together. In every interview that followed, reporters asked the same question. What do you think John would have thought of this? Paul always smiled before answering. He probably would have complained, he said. He would have said the strings were too sappy or my bass was too loud. That was John. Nothing was ever quite right. Then the smile would fade. But I think, somewhere he knows we finished it for him, and I hope that means something. The music video for Now and Then featured restored footage of all four Beatles, John and George, young and alive, mixed with modern shots of Paul and Ringo, older, weathered, but still playing. At one point in the video, John looks directly at the camera and winks. He seems to be saying, "What took you so long?" For Paul McCartney, Now and Then was never really about technology or chart positions, or proving the doubters wrong. It was about time. Time that had separated them, time that had silenced John's voice, time that Paul had spent wondering what might have been. If John had lived, if they had reconciled properly, if they had made more music together instead of wasting years on lawsuits and resentments. But time, it turned out, was not entirely linear. Because on November 2, 2023, the Beatles released a new song, Four Voices, Four Instruments, Four Friends, who had changed the world and been changed by it. The last song they would ever record. Paul still plays Now and Then in concert. When he reaches the final verse, he often pauses. The crowd goes silent. 80,000 people, holding their breath, watching an old man commune with ghosts, and then John's voice comes through the speakers, singing about time, about waiting, about a love that distance couldn't destroy. The audience doesn't just hear a song, they hear a miracle. They hear 70 years of rock and roll history, compressed into 4 minutes. They hear a 15-year-old boy who met another boy at a church fair. They hear two men who conquered the world and then lost each other. They hear a goodbye that took 43 years to complete. And somewhere in that crowd, every single time, someone whispers the same thing. Thank you, Paul, for bringing him back. The Beatles began on a summer day in 1957, when two teenagers discovered they shared the same wound, a missing mother, a hunger for something more. The Beatles ended on a November day in 2023, when the last survivor of that partnership used a machine to reach across death itself. Now and Then, a song John Lennon wrote alone a song Paul McCartney refused to let die, a song that proves perhaps what John always believed. In the end, the love you take is equal to the love you make. Paul McCartney is 82 years old. He still tours, still writes, still wakes up every morning reaching for a guitar. And somewhere in his studio, there's a cassette tape worn and faded, that once held an unfinished song. It's not unfinished anymore.